The contest between the United States and China is not a sprint. It's a marathon. It will last at least 20 years. It would be a huge mistake for China to underestimate the United States of America. The biggest asset that the United States has by far is not its aircraft carriers or F-135. It's the US dollar. The power of the US dollar is enormous.
Ambassador Kishore Mahbubani has distinguished himself in at least two distinct careers, the diplomatic one and the academic one. He served in the Singaporean Foreign Service for 33 years with great distinction, served twice as Singapore's ambassador to the UN, during which he also served as the president of the UN Security Council in 2001 and 2002. Served as permanent secretary of the foreign ministry for Singapore, and then post that in academia, in 2004 was appointed as the founding dean of the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy at NUS, National University of Singapore. He's a prolific author, and now most recently, his memoirs, Living the Asian Century, an undiplomatic memoir. As this US-China battle plays out, you've argued that, of course, for a country like Singapore, it's best to try and stay neutral, not to pick sides.
If Singapore had to face this situation alone, it would be very, very difficult. But ASEAN countries collectively are taking a position that we want to be friends with the United States and we want to be friends with China. Unlike the Cold War,
many countries within Asia seem to want a multipolar Asia. Does the Chinese establishment see the future of Asia as a multipolar Asia? Would they like it to be a China-dominated Asia?
When you deal with China, it's never black or white. As China becomes more and more powerful, it will become more assertive.
Do you expect any hot conflict in Asia over the next 3 to 5 years?
Now, since the Cold War ended, in these 35 years, there have been no major wars in Asia. But all the major wars are on the fringes of Europe, in Yugoslavia, in Ukraine, and it shows you that there's some degree of geopolitical competence in Asia.
What are the Chinese getting wrong?
I think the biggest challenge for China in the long run is how you ensure political succession. Because in China, it's very, very critical in their system to have a good, strong leader. I'm going to give you the secret of Singapore's success, free of charge. I captured this secret with a simple acronym, MPH, Meritocracy, Pragmatism, and then it's honest. Fighting corruption is the hardest thing in the world, and that's what Singapore has done an amazing job.
What is India getting right today?
The best way India can frighten the world is by opening up its economy. The more you expose Indians to competition, the more they thrive. That's how you get Satya Nadella. That's how you get Sundar Pichai. How many world leaders are there that can go to Moscow and hug Putin and go to Washington, D.C. and hug Donald Trump? There are very few leaders who can do what the Prime Minister of India can do. India should take advantage of this geopolitical sweet spot, develop close ties with as many countries as possible, but be very rational and calculating, and don't get seduced by rhetorical overtures.
I've been waiting to have this conversation with you. As I've mentioned to you, I think I've read your work over the years. I've seen you obviously on your many appearances on TV and otherwise. And of course, I think, as I mentioned in my own book, The Great Tech Game, we really need, as the world shifts, and as you've written so, I would say, forcefully about the rise of Asia, we need a lot more big picture thinkers like you coming from Asia and the rest of the world, because otherwise I feel a lot of our mainstream dialogues and the themes that those mainstream dialogues often carry end up being from the perspective of the West. And I think as the world finds its own new balance over the coming decades, very important to have voices like yours. So thank you for doing that, I think, as part of your career. I want to start off, obviously, touching upon your life story and your personal journey, which of course you've written about in, I would say, with great candor, great detail in your latest book, Living the Asian Century, which obviously we recommend everyone get if you haven't read already. I mentioned to you, I think, in our earlier conversation, many commonalities I saw personally as well, which made me relate greatly to the book, both from your childhood and the kind of struggles you saw growing up in Singapore in the 50s, 60s, and later. The scholarship, the president's scholarship that you got, I mentioned to you that for me also in my own, I would say, teenage years, the Singapore Airlines scholarship that I got, and I ended up in Singapore for a few years, really changed my own trajectory. And of course, I think some of your time spent at Harvard. I know you had very strong views about your time there as well. I happened to meet you in Singapore once, I think when President Drew Faust was there in Singapore a few years ago now. But the question I want to ask you, which gets to, I think, the core that you mentioned also, is the clash of values, right? Which obviously Sam Huntington and many others have written about, right? And you've referred to them as well in your book. Having lived this life that has spanned the West and the East, Singapore, but the US also, of course, your family is spread out around the world as a Sindhi family, as you talk about. Tell me, where do you land now in this idea and this debate around Western and Eastern values? Do you see it as a clash? Do you see that twain can meet, or do you feel like where have you landed now after a long career and life that has spanned these spaces? Where have you landed now on the question of values of the West and the East?
Well, thank you. First of all, thank you very much for having me on your show. I've enjoyed many of your recent interviews with Ruchi Sharma and with Arvind Banagria. And you begin with a very good question, because in some ways it captures the arc of the journey of my life,
Yeah,
Because I started off as a child, as I say very candidly in my memoirs. I grew up in a British colony, in a very poor British colony then. And the way the British colonized countries around the world, certainly the way they colonized Asia, was to ensure that they made you believe that we Asians, we were inferior.
inferior, of course.
I had a completely colonized mind as a child,
Yeah,
living in a British colony, and I thought that the white man would always be superior to the brown or yellow people that I lived with in Singapore. And so it's quite remarkable to go from a childhood where I felt inferior to the West, and then, like you, after having been educated in the West, and I must emphasize here that I'm an admirer of the West. I'm not
yeah,
anti-Western in any way. I do think that the success of Western civilization was a great gift to humanity, because if the West hadn't modernized and transformed itself first, we wouldn't be where we are today. Many of the great benefits that you and I have had from a modern education, Western education, is a gift from the West too. But what is amazing is that having grown up as a great admirer of the West, I have now come to a very strange corner in my life where now I begin to realize that the West has lost it in a very significant way. And the West doesn't even understand that they make up only 12% of the world's population, and 88% of the world's population lives outside the West. And what is shocking is that even though the West has these great universities that you and I have spent time on, I spent a year in Harvard as a visiting fellow. Just in early 2024, I was also in UPenn, where you've been
yeah,
as a visiting fellow. And it's amazing that even though the United States, and certainly Europe too, has these great universities, these great universities have failed to educate their population on the fact that we are now moving to a completely new world order. We are moving from a world where you had one dominant civilization a mono-civilizational world with the West dominating it, as I experienced in my childhood, to a multi-civilizational world, where you now got to understand the history and
Yeah.
background of all the other great civilizations on planet Earth. And it's shocking to see the amount of ignorance there is in the West about this new world that is emerging. And many in the West still, in one way or another, keep clinging on to this great illusion that Francis Fukuyama created with his essay, The End of
Yeah.
History, which said that, hey, we won the Cold War. The West doesn't have to adjust or to adapt to the world.
Yeah.
It's the rest of the world that has got to become westernized. And what was absurd about this thesis is that Francis Fukuyama did a lot of brain damage to the West because he put the West to sleep at precisely the time when Asia was waking up.
Yeah. Sense of complacency. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's amazing that, the West could fail to see that this was the moment of greatest historical change ever in human history, when suddenly so many civilizations that had been sleeping start to wake up.
Yeah.
And the West is not aware that they are waking up. So the level of ignorance, even in leading Western institutions for me, is quite shocking. And that's what puzzles me the most about
Yeah.
the state
Yeah.
of our
Yeah.
world today.
Yeah, yeah. And to be honest, I think that beyond the educational institutions, I would say even the media, right? So I think,
Hmm.
of course, global media, and as I was mentioning to you, I think that's one of the goals for me also in this podcast, having spanned both the West and the East, much like you've
Hmm.
spoken about, that I think very
Yeah, I'm
important.
glad, but yeah, I'm very glad you mentioned the media because I spent 10 years of my life in New York, and I can tell you, it was such a joy to read either the New York Times or the New
Yeah,
York Review of Books,
it
or
was,
even the New Yorker,
especially the Sunday New York
and
Times.
you
Yeah,
felt that wow, these people are so intelligent and so sophisticated. And now my life has come full circle, and I look at the New York Times and I read it every day, and I say these people don't get it. They don't understand that you can no longer pontificate to the rest of the
yeah,
world. You can no longer tell the world what needs to be done when you yourself are so lost as a society. So that's what is so puzzling today to me, how the West has lost its way.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Let's talk about that, right? The last time this shift of economic, cultural, geopolitical, military power happened, right, several hundred years ago, before the West really emerged as the dominant one.
Mm,
It wasn't a peaceful one, right?
mm,
When the Eurasian empires of the time, right, the Mughal and the Chinese and the
mm,
Ottomans and the various empires of the Eurasian landmass lost to Western
mm,
Europe first, the colonial powers that you've written about as well, and of course then eventually the US as well. That
mm,
transition was not peaceful, right? I mean, you and I
mm,
think, as
mm,
in your case, I think you've lived as a subject. I haven't, but I've
mm,
felt the same kind of colonial overhang in
mm,
many ways. It wasn't peaceful, right? I mean, that colonial time was not a peaceful time in our country's histories. And, as now Asia rises,
mm,
at least, we can talk about Africa and Latin America later, but at least as
mm,
Asia rises, one of the key geopolitical conflicts that all of us are now talking about, are seeing, are witnessing day in day out,
mm,
is this battle between the U.S. and China. Right, China
mm,
being the largest economy
mm,
after the U.S. Coming out of Asia, in many
mm,
ways representing the clash that
mm,
is uh,
mm.
seemingly
Yeah.
on there now. It's no longer on the cards either. So let's talk
Mm,
about that U.S.-China geopolitical conflict, right?
mm,
As I see it, it's become a geopolitical one, an economic one, a technology one, but also, as we've been discussing, a values one, right?
mm,
So I want to start, and of course, you have a provocative book that came out a few years ago called "Has China Won?" Um,
mm,
you've referred to it just now that the West has
mm,
lost it. Let's talk about that. Let's talk about your assessment of China economically, geopolitically, militarily, technologically, and
mm,
otherwise.
mm,
Since your book came out,
mm,
have your views changed? And where do you
mm.
feel China today stands?
Well, I can tell you that I'm glad you emphasize that when the West arose and dominated the world, it did so in a very violent fashion.
Yeah.
And to me, one of the great mysteries of my life, which I hope to solve someday, is how is it 100 years ago, in the year 1925, 100,000 Englishmen could effortlessly colonize 300 million Indians? I mean, that's a great mystery to me. Looking where we are today,
Yeah.
can you imagine? Can you imagine Boris Johnson sending 100,000 Englishmen to come and rule India today? It would be such a joke, right? And
Well,
yet, that's
one can
what
argue
is
that there's
shocking.
a new form of
That,
digital colonialism that
yeah,
might be
yeah.
given effectively
So,
with
so
even
what,
fewer
what's
people.
amazing is how much life has changed since then.
Yeah.
You know? And but going back to U.S. and China, it is actually quite shocking that so few Americans appreciate the fact that China has managed to go from being a very poor country to becoming such a powerful economy, and has done so relatively peacefully. It hasn't fought a major war in 45 years. Now, that in the annals of history will go down as something quite unusual. In fact, as you know, there's a Harvard professor, I'm sure you've met, um, Graham Allison,
Of course.
uh, who's also written a book, as you know,
Yeah, the Associated
called
Press.
Destined for War, on the US China contest. And in that book, he says Americans keep wishing that China should be like the United States of America. He says, be careful what we wish for. Where China is today is where the United States was in the 1890s when it emerged as a great power.
Yeah.
And and as soon as America became a great power, what did he do? Declared war on Spain, seized the territory called Philippines on the other side of the world, you know? So frankly, it is normal for great powers to exercise their military muscles very quickly. For China not to have done so is a historical aberration. Now, it doesn't mean that they won't do it in the future, but so far they've been rising peacefully, and so it will be in America's national interest to try and continue to see China emerge peacefully rather than emerge as a belligerent power, which is why, one of the central insights of my book, Has China Won, is an insight that was given to me by Henry Kissinger in a one on one lunch I had with him in 2018, where he said, whereas the Chinese have a long term strategy for managing their rise, which is how they manage to rise peacefully, but the Americans don't have a comprehensive long term strategy for managing the rise of China, which is why you get this all kinds of ad hoc measures being taken against China with no strategy or long term game plan. In my book, Has China Won, I say that if you want to formulate a long term strategy, you got to answer 10 questions, which I spell out in Has
Yeah.
China Won. And I must say, I'm not doing this as an enemy of the United States. I'm doing this as a friend of the United States. Hey, saying, hey, you're getting yourself into a big contest. Why don't you first work out a strategy?
Yeah.
What are you trying to do? And even when you want to work out a strategy, the first thing you got to do, a strategy is for a purpose of achieving some goals. So what are the goals you're trying to accomplish? Are you trying to isolate China? Are you isolate the Soviet Union? Cannot be done. Because China trades more with the world than the United States does. You can't isolate China. Are you trying to overthrow the Chinese Communist Party? It cannot be done. Because the Chinese Communist Party, having delivered the best 50 years of development, right, that China's ever had, enjoys a tremendous amount of domestic legitimacy within China. And so, are you trying to, you know, uh, in one way or another, uh, stop China's economic development? It cannot be done.
Yeah.
Because right now, the Chinese have invested so much into the industries of the future. You can't stop China's growth anymore. And let me just give you two statistics so that every person listening to this show must understand how phenomenal China's rise has been. As you know, Deng Xiaoping launched the Four Modernizations program in 1979. In 1980, the combined GNP of the European Union was 10 times the size of China.
Yeah.
Today, China and Europe are about the same size. By 2050, Europe will be half the size of China. So imagine in the space of one human lifetime, 70 years, 1980 to 2050,
Yeah.
Europe is going to go from being 10 times bigger than China to
To
half the
half.
size. Right?
Phenomenal.
Future historians will look at this and see, wow, this is amazing that it happened. Now, let me give you another statistic. In the year 2000, China's share of global manufacturing was 5%. By 2030, it'll be 45%. Now, these are incredible leaps that
Yeah.
China
No,
has made.
absolutely. Absolutely.
China is not perfect. China's got challenges. China's got problems. Over the next 2-3 years, Chinese economy is going to struggle, no question.
Yeah.
But ask yourself, where will China be 10 years from now?
Yeah.
The Chinese never think in 2 months or 2 years or 3 years. That's
Yeah,
not their
correct.
time frame.
They're known for long term, correct?
And if you ask yourself, which leading economy in the world has invested more in the industries of the future than any other economy? It's China. No, whether it's electric vehicles,
Yeah.
solar panels, wind turbines, battery technology, even many fields of AI, quantum.
Yeah.
China has invested so much in these areas.
No,
So
absolutely.
to think that you can stop China is an illusion.
So let me posit this to you, Kishore, which is that from a few of the conversations I've had in my own sense, that I think that while there hasn't been a clear articulation maybe of the long-term strategy as you were critiquing, right, in the US approach towards China, one can argue that their strategy is very simply to keep China as number two and remain as number one, right?
Yes, I
And
think
to
I think
that
that's
extent, to
clearly.
keep the gap between the US and China to be a relatively big or at least decent gap. And to that extent, if you think about it from that perspective, it becomes very clear that they're not looking to isolate necessarily. I wouldn't even want to comment on whether they want to remove the CCP from power. But really, their goal is that whether it comes to technological advancements in AI, in clean energies, green energies, EVs, um, in general other technologies like quantum, or whether it's in trade and supply chains and their connectivity with the rest of the world and their ability to remain an exporting power, or their ability to sustain the kind of growth that they've been seeing. I think the US strategy is very clear. Let's make China go slow on each of these and speed up our own rise so that that gap remains. Of course, they've done this successfully
Yeah.
earlier, and that's where my next question comes to you. Do you see any historical analogs that help you think about this battle? You, of course, we've
Yeah.
talked about that transition. The US has beaten, one can argue, the Soviet Union earlier in a major battle, right, over decades. Then Japan gave it a economic, if not geopolitical, but at least an economic run for its money in the 80s. And now, of course, China. And um, do you have any historical analogs that help you think
Yeah.
about this?
Well, you're right. I mean, you're absolutely right that there is a determination on the part of the American establishment, broadly speaking, and possibly even parts of American society, for America trying to retain its primacy
Correct.
vis-a-vis China. But there are two ways to win a race, as you know. One is to run faster, and the other way is to kneecap your opponent. And the United States
Wants to do
should
both.
try to run faster. And I think it can run faster. But to run faster, it's got to fix its own society. And as you know, in my book, Has China Won, I point out that the biggest limitations on American growth are not external, they are internal. The United States society has functionally become a plutocracy. And it's interesting that Joe Biden, in his farewell address,
Yes,
I don't know whether he read chapter
I
7 of my
did.
book, China One. That's exactly the argument I made, that America has also become an oligarchy. And the danger in that is that with all the wealth being so concentrated, and with the bottom 50% not seeing any improvement in their standard of living, you are creating a very angry domestic society. And frankly, that's how you get to elect a president like Donald Trump, because the American people are so angry, they want to vote for an angry man who will kick Washington, D.C. in the butt. But, frankly, you cannot make America great again if you have a president like Donald Trump, who's certainly not going to inspire the world, who's certainly not going to make the world believe that America will pay any price, bear any burden to rescue a society on the other side of the world. Donald Trump says, "To hell with you. My job is to make America great again." That's not how you're going to win that contest.
Can I push back on that a little bit
Sure.
for the sake of
Sure, please do.
the thinking further? So, if you look back, right, and one of the things I did in my book, Sure, the Great Tech Game, was to go back into history and see what were the great games in the past in which different nations or regions prospered, and what caused them to, right? What were the reasons? And many, of course, many much more illustrious people have given this thought to the rise and fall of nations, etc. So as I went back, you can look back at the UK, you can look back at the US, you can look back even to India and China back in the day, right? Or Egypt or Mesopotamia, right? And all these civilizations, one can argue, and this is the argument I make in my book, is that societal divisions, societal issues, inequality, all of these issues have existed in societies and economies like India's and China's and Egypt's and the UK's, right? I mean, the UK is famously like class of lords and, the upper house. Despite that, what has driven their economic rise, their prosperity, one can argue, has been a different cause of reasons, right? Which today, I argue, is what I call the great tech game, which is mastery over technology, technological advancements, right? Technological capabilities. And today, if you look at the US, despite all the issues that I'm pointing out, the US is very proudly now showcasing that its economy is growing fast. Its big tech firms today are growing much, much bigger. And yes, there is the issue that even Ruchir pointed out, and you are pointing out, that they are getting too big for their own good in many ways. But really, if the US continues to master and be the leader in technological advancements, my question to you is, can you really see a scenario where other countries rise above?
Well, I mean, I'm really glad you pushed back, because I think it's important for me to also emphasize that, as I do in my book, Has China Won, that it'd be a huge mistake for China to underestimate the United States of America. Huge mistake. In fact, I begin the book with a hypothetical memo to President Xi Jinping saying, please, we have taken on this contest with the United States. Of course, China will win, but we must never underestimate the United States of America. And there's no question, I must say, that when you spend time in American universities, you also experience the dynamism of the innovation in science and technology and so on and so forth. So I think it's a mistake to underestimate the United States. But at the same time, you are also aware that America's greatest growth period happened in the 50s, 60s, when the American middle class was growing, and America was a happy society then, and that happy society sent men to the moon and did these extraordinary things. Now, after that, what also kept United States going was that United States also became a magnet for global talent, right?
Yeah.
Now, I can tell you this, that if Donald Trump carries out his declared intention of exporting migrants and cutting off flow of talent into United States,
that'd be a mistake.
That's going to be one of the biggest
blunders,
self-inflicted wounds that can impose on American society. But why is that happening? Why is an open society that welcome migrants now locking the doors? Now it's locking the doors because people within the door said, "I'm not being taken care of. You're not taking care of me." That's the connection between my point about plutocracy and American talent. And secondly, when you mentioned that the American economy has been doing well, and I agree it's been doing well, you also have to look at the massive budget deficits You also have to look at the size of the American debt, which has grown from 70% to 120%.
Yeah,
Please
the GDP.
double check. Please Google and double check the figures.
Yeah, it's about
Now,
30, 33 trillion now.
at some point in time, these American economists are pointing this out. Okay,
Yes.
these huge budget deficits and huge national debt will become unsustainable. And if you have to spend more on servicing on your debts than you have to pay for your defense budget, you are crippling yourself.
Absolutely.
In terms of, and if you look at the longer history of humanity, what's the one thing that brings empires down in the end is when they overspend,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
And so there are also structural. So far, you haven't seen the impact of these structural changes. So I say this as a friend of the United
Yeah.
States. You are actually competing with a power that is very disciplined and very careful about what it does. And you have the benefit of, and the biggest asset that the United States has by far, it's not its aircraft carriers or F-135, it's the US dollar. The power of the US dollar is enormous,
Phenomenal.
right?
Yeah.
And the just with that, but at the same time, because this again, American economists say that when the US dollar is the global reserve currency, it gives the US an exorbitant privilege.
Yeah.
It can print money and grow its economy because the rest of the world will suck up the US dollars, right?
Yeah.
But that exorbitant privilege depends also on making the rest of the world trust the US dollar.
Yeah.
I can tell you that after the United States decided to impound $300 billion worth of Russian assets, a lot of countries have quietly said, okay, maybe I should put my money somewhere.
Yeah. Most notably China, correct? And gold.
Where it cannot be seized, right? So remember, the United States has got to see this. The contest between the United States and China is not a sprint. It's a marathon.
Yeah.
It will last at least 20 years. At least 20 years. Now, in this marathon, if you keep sprinting ahead, thinking, oh, I'm ahead, and you don't ask yourself, hey, do I have the energy and the resources to keep going at this
Yeah.
pace
And
for
the
the
long
next
game.
26 miles? Is not so sure whether they have it. You cannot sustain this debt. You cannot sustain. Now, no American government today, for example, can cut social security benefits. And the cost of these social security benefits is going to grow significantly.
Yeah.
So there are all these long-term structural challenges that are coming down the road facing United States. These are the things it should be focused on if
Yeah.
it wants to win the long-term race.
Yeah.
With,
Yeah. No, I think,
and that's the
yeah.
kind of long-term strategic thinking that is missing in the United States.
Yeah. No, I think so. I think I agree with you, and I think previous guests on our podcast, like you mentioned, Ruchir and others, have mentioned this structural problem with the high debt and high deficit.
Yeah, written about this quite
Of
clearly.
course, yeah, and he talks about it as almost like a ill-facing capitalism as a system now in the U.S., right? So now let me go to the other side, right? And given that this is now you eloquently, I think, shared with us your view on what the U.S. is getting wrong in its battle, geopolitical and battle for primacy with China. What are the Chinese getting wrong?
Well, I think the biggest challenge for China in the long run, not that they're getting it wrong, but it's a big challenge for them, is how you ensure political succession. Because in China, it's very, very critical in their system to have a good, strong leader. And in my book, Has China Won? I document something which is very uncomfortable for the Chinese, which is that the predecessor of President Xi Jinping, President Hu Jintao, was a relatively weak president, and under his watch, two political monsters emerged in Chinese society. The first political monster was corruption, and then the second political monster was factionalism. And in fact, as you know, Bo Xilai and Zhou Yonggang tried to almost mount a coup d'etat that could have stopped President Xi Jinping from coming into office. So it shows you in the Chinese system, when you have a weak leader, you can have these massive problems that can come up. And that's why President Xi has focused very hard on getting rid of corruption. He sees this as a cancer in Chinese society that could bring China down, and also keeping very strong control of the government. But how do you ensure that President Xi is succeeded by somebody who's also strong and competent like him? So that, I think, is the big challenge for China. But the way that China can overcome this, of course, is by ensuring that within the Chinese Communist Party, you ensure very high standards of meritocracy within the party. And that's what kept the Chinese empires going. As you know, Chinese empires would last 200 to 300 years, by the way.
Yeah.
And what kept them going? A meritocratic system of selecting the best people to be in the government. And so far, I would say that is the strength of the Chinese Communist Party. It's able to attract the best to come to the party.
Yeah.
And I tell the story of when I was researching my book, Has China Won? I spent some time at Columbia University, and my research assistant, Columbia University gave me a research assistant, was a young Chinese girl. So I said, "What was life like when you grew up?" She says, "Oh, I was so disappointed when I finished my high school." "Why?" She said, "I came in number 2 in the high school." I said, "Wow,
The
number
typical
2, that's
Asian
great.
parents.
What's so bad about that?" She looked very sad and she said, "Number 2 is bad because only number 1 is selected to join the Chinese Communist Party."
Yeah, yeah,
Can you imagine that?
yeah, yeah.
The aspiration of a young person is to become number 1 in the high school so you can join the Chinese Communist Party. Now,
Technically,
if you can attract that kind of talent,
yeah,
and I have spoken at the Chinese Party school at the level of people who are vice ministers, governors
yeah,
of provinces. And when you talk to a room like that in Beijing, the quality of mind of the people in the Chinese government is quite stunning.
yeah,
So you're dealing with people here. And by the way, in the Chinese system, you cannot get a Barack Obama. You cannot go from being someone who works in social work, becomes a senator for 2 years, and becomes a president. You have to have run a province, you have to run a
yeah.
city, you would have to have taken on serious responsibilities before you can move up.
Yeah, yeah. No, I was recently reading Ke Jin's book as well, the New China Playbook. And she also documents this, right? The idea that as the leader of a province, you have to demonstrate economic growth, GDP growth, your ability
Yeah,
to like
that's
take
right.
businesses along. And that's really your stepping stone
And,
to
and social harmony.
and social
And
harmony.
social harmony.
Yeah. So I think all of these things that you pointed out, the challenges of corruption and factionalism that China has to deal with. Now, there's, of course, a bigger monster lying outside also, which is, I would say that unlike the years of the peaceful rise of China, when it goes from, as you were saying, 1/10 of the European economy to now almost equal. There was a time when the US and Europe were also benefiting from China's rise, and there was a nice, arrangement there that was helping US and European businesses and the Chinese economy. But now, if you look at the next 10 years of this competition, the US and the Europeans are much like the Chinese girl who was your research assistant at Columbia saying, the US is saying, I don't want to be number 2. I only want to be number 1, right?
Yeah.
And I'll come back to that because I think that's a values-based problem also later. But in a scenario where the US and Europe, the large economic heavyweights along with China in the world, and to some extent India, the other heavyweight, economic heavyweight emerging now on the global stage as the fourth largest economy soon, in light of not positive relations, do you think the Chinese economy can continue to grow the way it has? Even if they were to get the meritocracy correct and the factionalism and the corruption, you need the rest of the world to grow. And if the rest of the world doesn't want it and doesn't want it like really strongly, right? I mean, the US couldn't be less clear about what it wants, as we've been discussing.
You're absolutely right that in the early phases of Chinese growth, both the Americans and Europeans were very magnanimous, and certainly The Americans were very magnanimous in allowing China to join the WTO, although they didn't anticipate the long-term consequences for
Correct.
themselves. But here, this brings me to another point about how the Chinese are thinking strategically. You know, when I mentioned that their share of the global manufacturing has gone up from 5% to
Yeah, which
45%,
is incredible.
that's not by accident, that's by design.
Yeah.
And what's the design here? You know, if let's say tomorrow, if the United States decided, for whatever reason, I'm going to declare war on China, and the Chinese said, okay, war has come, we will now stop all our exports to China, to the United States. You know what's going to happen? An incredible number of American companies will collapse.
No, absolutely. And consumer
And
inflation
you know,
will happen.
Take Apple for example, right? This phone, Apple, right? You know how many of its critical components come from China? The dependency on China, by the way, of Apple hasn't gone down, it has gone up in recent years. Now, this is by design. In Tesla, for example, makes its cheapest and best cars in China.
China, yeah.
So you can go on and on. So I think what the Chinese therefore have engineered is a situation whereby the United States can put sanctions on China. But as you know, even after all the tariffs that Trump and Biden have put on China, Chinese exports to United States continue to grow. And by the way, and if you want to do a true measurement of Chinese exports to the United States, you got to measure not just the exports that go directly from China to the United States. You got to measure the Chinese exports to the United States that go via Vietnam,
Via
that go
Mexico,
via
of
Mexico,
course.
that go via Malaysia, so many countries. So, you know, the Chinese therefore have created a deep interdependence. And here, one point I want to make is very, very important is that you got to make a big distinction between the United States and Europe. Europe today has completely lost its way. I'm not exaggerating. If you go to Europe, you'll find this deep pessimism
Yes.
because the Europeans have become sadly geopolitically incompetent. They could have prevented this war in Ukraine. Any reasonable statesman could have prevented this war of Ukraine. But I can tell you, I had another one-on-one conversation with Henry Kissinger about a year before he died in October 2022 in his office in New York. And he basically hinted to me, you know, the usual subtle Kissingerian way, that the quality of mind of European leaders is not what it used to be. You know, at the end of the day, the United States is still a powerful, dynamic economy, whereas Europe, that used to be the same size as the United States in the year 2000,
Yeah, it's crazy.
now somewhere between half to two-thirds the size of the American
Yeah,
economy.
no, I've seen that. I've
Something has
seen that
gone.
chart also. It's very telling.
And
Yes.
let me give a statistic that will be shocking to your Indian listeners. You know, you mentioned that India is the fifth largest economy, about to become fourth largest economy. In some ways, India is about the same size as ASEAN, if I'm not mistaken, combined. And you know what? In the years 2010 to 2020, ASEAN added more to global economic growth than the European Union did, even though ASEAN is one-fifth the size of European Union.
Yeah.
That's an example of how the European Union has lost its way.
Yeah.
So when you speak about the West, you must always make a big distinction because the United States is still so
It
dynamic
is.
in
It
so
is.
many sectors. And you know this better than I do. For example, in AI, they're clearly way ahead of everybody
Yeah. Yeah,
else.
no,
Way
that's right.
ahead.
That's right. That's right.
And the Chinese are going to have a very hard time catching up with the United States. Very
So,
hard
so,
time.
so, so your argument is that the two are so intertwined. The Chinese have created this manufacturing almost dependence on themselves,
Hmm.
on the US's part by design, and that'll continue whether directly or indirectly.
Hmm.
So, is your sense then, net, that geopolitically the US will not be able to shave off at least a couple of percentage of GDP points of the Chinese economic growth? You think the Chinese
I
economic
mean,
growth will continue at the level it's been?
yeah. I mean, I always declare myself to be a member of an endangered
Yes, I
species
read that.
called
The
the
China
China
optimist.
optimist. Yes. And I genuinely, but I always, but you see, you got to judge China. Never look at a 2 or 3 year time horizon. As I said, the next 2 to 3 years are going to be very difficult for
For
China.
them, yeah.
No question. But that's not what the Chinese are focused on. They're never thinking about the next 2 to 3 years. Okay, they're having a very hard time fixing the real estate bubble that grew. It's a huge bubble. They're having a very hard time. They're struggling, no question. But slowly, steadily, they're fixing the problem.
Yeah.
So the question is, where will they be 10 years from now? And 10 years from now, they'll be much more integrated with the rest of the world than they are even today.
Today.
Rest of the world will need Chinese manufacturing prowess in so many areas. And they have created now very deep links. I can tell you that as a China watcher myself, I thought I more or less know what's happening, what big things happening with China. When President Xi Jinping went to Peru for the APEC leaders meeting and opened a $1 billion port, which is one of the most advanced ports in the world, I said, wow, I didn't even hear about it. And what has that created? It's created deep interdependence between all of Latin America and China. Because this is an amazing port. The latest technology is all there to facilitate trade
Yeah.
flows. So the strategic long-term investments that they have made. And here I'm going to make a somewhat uncomfortable point for India. For India also, and I think India is right to want to become a manufacturing power. But if you did your sums correctly, and at the end of the day, you could be very rational and hard-headed when it comes to these economic sums. For India to emerge as a manufacturing power, it also has got to import more Chinese components.
Yeah,
That's
no, I think
part of
India is aware of that.
that's part of it. And so if you try to cut off yourself from China,
Yeah.
and that's the Chinese strategy, you're in some ways preventing your own
Yeah, yeah,
development.
yeah, 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 yeah.
Which is why I hope that within India also people will be thinking long term and strategically and say, how do we get the best out of this world?
Yeah, yeah, no, absolutely. And I think that I think that the battle between the U.S. and China and Latin America, which you've now alluded to with the mention of the port in Peru, I think it's going to be a very interesting one to watch. Of course, given it is in the U.S.'s neighborhood, but also for India, I think that I've had many conversations. You mentioned that you watched the one with Dr. Panagria and others, and I think one of the key trends that we haven't spoken to, but I've spoken to others, especially economists in my previous conversations about is where is globalization headed, and is it going to be? Is there a greater future in trade of manufactured goods, or is there a greater future in trade of services in the coming 20, 30, 40 years? And most economists today, most watchers of the global economy and the nature of the future of work. And supply chains tend to believe that the future lies in globalization of services, right? Greater trade of services and digital services. And I think as India thinks about its own role and its own trade links with the rest of the world, manufacturing is, of course, one vertical, and there I think there will inevitably be, much like for other countries in the world, a dependence on Chinese components, at least for the foreseeable future. But I think the more interesting opportunity for India is to emerge like what China has done over the last 30, 40 years as the great services nation and great services export nations in the world economy, right? But let me now move to Singapore.
Yeah,
Sorry, go ahead.
just very quickly, a quick comment on India. I think there's tremendous opportunity for India. But if as you know, I'm a friend of India. I'm Indian, okay. And what puzzles me is this: Indians just thrive so well in competition.
Yes.
Where look at any corner of the world. I got first cousins in Guyana, Suriname, Texas, Florida, London, Nigeria, Ghana, Mumbai, Calcutta, Hong Kong, Japan. They're competing in so many different environments. You know what? They're all doing very well. Indians compete very well.
Yes.
So the one big idea that I think India needs to embrace is that the best way India can frighten the world is not by closing up its economy, it's by opening up its economy more and more.
Yeah.
Because the more you expose Indians to competition, the more they thrive. That's how you get Satya Nadella. That's how you get Sundar Pichai. And I know you're right. India can compete in services. But the way you do that is you open up your markets preemptively and create a big shock. And that at the end of the day is what China did. When it joined the WTO, Du Rongji in some ways was so happy that the West was arm twisting China into opening up its economy because he was using the Western pressure to open China to competition.
That's
Now, there's one big idea India should embrace. It's
yeah.
this: we can compete with anybody. Let's open up our economy.
Yeah.
That's the one big thing that I think can launch India up into
Yeah,
the
yeah, 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 yeah. No, absolutely. I think even in our conversation, Dr. Panigri, I think this embrace of markets and competition and then
that.
seeing the opportunity of trade, right, which is
And the rest
upwards
of the
of
world
30 trillion a year,
should be frightened. They should be frightened. My God.
yeah, as the major.
1.3, 1.4 billion Indians are going to compete with us.
Right. Let's now move to Singapore, Ambassador Mahbubani, and then I'm going to come back to India in a little bit. But I want to get your views on Singapore, right? Singapore, I've lived there, I've seen its strengths. Um, it has, in my book, made it to a couple of different chapters because it is, one of those entrepots of the world that has managed to move from being, at some point, let's say a trading hub as part of Malacca and that region, to a financial services hub in the great capitalism game. It's become a great hub for capitalism and now and a window into Asia, gateway to Asia for many global firms. And it's now also trying to position itself as, I would say, what I've called a digital entrepot, a country that, despite its small size and small population, etc., continues to play an outsized role in what I've called the great tech game, right? The great tech competition that's going on today in the world, right? So I want to ask you a couple of different questions about Singapore. The first one I want to get to is, you've written about this in your book, Living the Asian Century. What are the key secrets of Singapore's success that you feel other countries could learn from, regardless of size, right?
Well,
That have made
you,
it successful and then continue to make it dynamic?
well, you're right. I mean, I must say, as I emphasize in my book, Living the Asian Century, I was born in Singapore by accident. I mentioned I have first
Yes.
cousins in one of the world. I could have been born in Guyana, in Suriname, in Nigeria, but I ended up being born in Singapore. And that was the biggest fortunate accident of my life because I had no idea that I was going to be born in a society. And as you know, I do say outrageous things from time to time. One of the most outrageous things I say is that Singapore has been the most successful society since human history began. And what do I mean by that? Singapore has improved the living standards of its people more quickly and more comprehensively than any other human society has in human history.
Yeah.
So I as a child, I was living in a very third world society with a per capita income of $500. My house had no flush toilet. I was put in a special feeding program when I was young. And now I'm living in a society where the per capita income is
Yeah.
$88,000.
Incredible.
Higher than that of United States or United Kingdom. Now that's amazing, right? And I benefited from it. But I also, when I was dean of the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, I told my students, I gave them every one of them same lecture. I said, I'm going to give you the secret of Singapore's success free of charge. And I said to them also that if you can implement the secret, I guarantee you success, right? And I captured this secret with a simple acronym, MPH. MPH doesn't stand for miles per hour. It stands number one for meritocracy, which we have spoken about, and which is again the Chinese advantage. By the way, the United States also has a meritocracy, I must emphasize.
Of course.
The competition to get into American universities creates a tremendously
Yeah,
powerful
well, I mean,
meritocracy.
they've benefited as being the global
Yeah,
magnet for talent
so
for that reason, right? The
exactly.
talent
So
says that's where my merit will get
So
most
all
reward.
the great societies are basically built on meritocracy.
Yeah,
You pick the best minds to fill the most important positions in private sector, in government, and elsewhere. Singapore is an incredible meritocracy. To get to senior position in government, you really got to compete your way
yeah,
all the way to the top. And then the second P, the P stands for pragmatism. And here, the best definition of pragmatism was given by Deng Xiaoping, the Chinese leader, when he said it doesn't matter whether a cat is black, a cat is white, if a cat is mounted, it's a good cat.
that's right.
So it doesn't matter whether it's capitalism or communism, whatever works, we use it. So Singapore, as you notice, is a complete mishmash,
Yeah,
right? We are very, very capitalist in some areas, right? Look at our banking sector, look at our tech sector, and so on and so forth, right? And yet, look at our social policies. About 80% of the population live in homes that are built by the public sector, right? It's like a socialist paradise,
yeah,
right? So we take elements from capitalism, socialism, whatever works, we use it. That's Singapore's pragmatism. We copy from every country in the world. Singapore is the best copycat country in the world. So why, Dr. Goh Keng Swee, the architect of Singapore's economic miracle, said to me, Kishore, no matter what problem we encounter, it's never a new problem.
yeah,
Somebody somewhere has encountered that problem before. Let's go and see how they solved it and adapt it to Singapore.
yeah,
And we don't understand why other countries don't become copycat countries. It's so easy. And then the final, of course, age is the hardest one, is honesty, which means zero corruption. Now, Singapore really has got zero or near zero corruption. And that's the hardest part for most societies in the world. Because even in the United States of America, if you want to be very brutally candid about this, the United States has no illegal corruption, but it has a lot of legal corruption. It's the only country in the world where you can pay the congressman to pass legislation that will benefit your company, like the pharmaceutical companies. You can pass legislation that says that the VAT agency of the United States cannot negotiate prices
yeah,
with pharmaceutical companies. Now, come on. That's corruption. It's legal, but it's corruption. So fighting corruption is the hardest thing in the world. And that's what Singapore has done an amazing job, because we had three incredible founding fathers, Lee Kuan Yew, Goh Keng Swee, Rajaratnam. If we didn't have these three great men, who are surrounded by other great men too, by the way, we wouldn't have come where we are today. So that is the secret of Singapore's success, and it's easily accessible.
yeah. And I'm glad you mentioned those three men, because those three men, of course, make a lot of appearances in your book. They've been, I think, they've shaped your own, I think, as you've called it, geopolitical realism, right? From the idealism that you began with, I think you attribute these three men for training
Yeah.
you in geopolitical realism. And that's my next question about Singapore, which is, as this US-China battle plays out, and if it continues to play out the way it's playing out, and not how you would wish it to play out, or how many other parts of the rest of the world might want it to play out, if it does play out in a fairly, I would say, confrontational way, and my way or the highway, you have to choose sides. The most recent AI export controls that President Biden has left his office with, again, categorizes countries basis that you've seen that. So if it continues this way, you've argued that, of course, for a country like Singapore, it's best to try and stay neutral, not to pick sides. That's what you've argued that the rest of the world also wants. We don't want to pick sides. We don't want to be in a Cold War-esque situation. India, of course, and many other countries in the world during the Cold War also wanted to not pick sides. So that idea is not new. But my question is more realist. Can Singapore end up staying neutral? Or will it have to pick sides sooner than later?
Well, you're absolutely right to point out that the growing contest between US and China, and I've been predicting for so many years that the contest between US and China will grow, creates a huge strategic dilemma for Singapore. Absolutely no doubt. And we will definitely be put in a difficult position if we are asked to choose sides between the United States and China, which is why the first leader in the world to publicly come out and say, we will not take sides, is Singapore. Then Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong gave a speech in the Shangri-La Dialogue many years ago, 4 or 5 years ago, saying we won't choose sides. And then he followed up with a longer article in the magazine Foreign Affairs saying, again, we won't choose sides. But you're right. If Singapore had to face this situation alone, it would be very, very difficult. But fortunately for Singapore, we're now surrounded by what I consider to be, frankly, the most successful regional organization in the world, which is ASEAN, right? And ASEAN as a whole has 700 million people almost. It is a valuable buffer for Singapore because the ASEAN countries collectively are taking a position that we want to be friends with the United States and we want to be friends with China. Now, of course, some of us may be closer to
I was going to
United States.
say, yes.
Vietnam is closer to United States, and some of us may be closer to China, like Laos and Cambodia. But at the same time, wherever they are, despite their relative closeness to one side or the other, they still take the position that we will not choose sides.
How would you characterize Singapore and Indonesia? Leaning which way more?
Well, I think Singapore and Indonesia are very careful in keeping ties equally good with both of them. I mean, look at General Prabowo, the new president of Indonesia. Where did he go for his first overseas trip? To Beijing. And then where did he go after that? To Washington D.C.
He's coming to India
So,
as its Republic Day guest next.
yeah. Oh, he is. Oh, wonderful. Oh, you made a brilliant choice. Brilliant choice.
Yeah.
But anyway, you can see that. By the way, he invited me, General Prabowo, President Prabowo, to give 6 lectures to his incoming team of 360 people. So I gave 6 sets of lectures on the principles of geopolitics and on principles of governance to his incoming team. So he's taking his responsibilities very seriously. But you can see very clearly that Indonesia has made it very clear that it wants to be friends with both China and the United States, And, remember the reason why President Jokowi decided to opt for Chinese vaccines in the height of COVID is because he sent a minister who called on President Trump, And this minister was a friend of Donald Trump. I said, Mr. President, you have surplus vaccines. Why don't you give some to us? We pay for it. Give some to us. And President Donald Trump said, American vaccines are for American people. So, that's why Indonesia said, okay, we have to keep our options open.
Yeah.
So, even for a country as big as Indonesia, they have to keep their options open. And by the way, the other thing that's also very important to add here, unlike the Cold War, whereas, paradoxically, communist China was with democratic United States and democratic India was closer to undemocratic Soviet Union. In the Cold War, the United States succeeded in getting so many countries to align in one way or another with the United States. They got all of Europe, They got South Korea, they got Japan, they got Egypt, they got Indonesia, they got Brazil, they got Pakistan, right? Today, all the countries I mentioned, right? None of them have declared that they will be an ally of the United States against China. Not one.
Well, if you were to assess Chinese...
And they may be closer to the United States, but all of them, in one way or another, are still keeping up their ties with China too. Even Japan and South Korea.
And largely because of, I think, that economic dependency factor as well, right? Of course.
which is again part of the Chinese strategy to create dependency on the Chinese economy.
That's right. That's right. It's I've seen it. It's almost like a stated goal of creating that interdependency of the world on you.
And the thing that worries me about United States a great deal now is that Americans used to be in the Cold War. So Singapore, as you know, was very close to the United States in the Cold War. When we were fighting against the Vietnamese occupation of Cambodia, the US, Chinese, and Singapore and ASEAN delegations worked very closely together. And in those days, the American diplomats were very good listeners. And sometimes I would tell the Americans, why don't you speak out loud more? They say, no, it's better for us if ASEAN takes the lead and we take a back seat, right? Very smart.
Yeah.
Today, the Americans are not good listeners anymore. And you know, when you listen to American senators and they speak about the world, and they say, we will win the world in the competition against China, they should travel. They should go, they should go to Brazil, the nearest big country close to United States.
Yeah.
And a Brazilian diplomat said to me, in the year 2000, it took Brazil 1 year to export $1 billion to China. Today, it takes Brazil 72 hours to export $1 billion to China.
Yeah.
So you're telling Brazil, hey, choose me.
Yeah. Yeah.
You're creating what do you, therefore, it's important for the United States, if it's going to win this contest against China, to listen very carefully. And I'm trying to do my best as a friend of the United States and say, listen to me, I'm telling you what the world thinks.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. You've spoken about the world as multipolar, multi-civilizational, multilateral. I want to ask you the same question about Asia, right? In I think as India thinks about its relationship with China within the context of Asia, I think probably many other nations within Asia that have either territorial disputes with China in the South China Sea or elsewhere. There's this growing sense, it seems to me, that much like many of these countries want a multipolar world, and as you're saying, the ability to choose and not have to, choose one side or the other, but to have good ties across the board, maybe. Many countries within Asia seem to want a multipolar Asia. It's the perspective of many countries, though, that that's not the Chinese view of Asia, right? Much like the US wants a unipolar world and not let there be a bipolar or multipolar world. It seems to many countries within Asia that China, much like the US at the world level, at the Asia level, wants a slightly more unipolar Asia than other countries would be comfortable with. What's your sense on that? Are we going to have a
Well,
multipolar
I would
Asia
say,
or are we going to have a unipolar Asia?
one of the biggest mistakes we make in trying to understand China is that we often use Western categories. So it's unipolar, multipolar. It's black or white and things like that. And when you deal with China, it's never black or white, right?
I
And this
mean,
is
it's
what
never
is
black or white with the US either.
there are various nuances here.
Yeah.
Now, there is absolutely no question that as China becomes more and more powerful, it will become more assertive. It will push its strategic weight, no question.
Yeah.
But it's also realized that there are ways and means of doing it where you don't force countries into a corner. You don't force them to choose, right? But what you do, therefore, is you enhance your relations slowly, step by step by step, right? And I give the best example from this, frankly, is Vietnam. Now, the one country that is terrified of China is Vietnam. Okay, Vietnamese have been dealing with China for 2,000 years,
Right.
and they were occupied by China only 1,000 years. Only 1,000 years. They know the Chinese very well, right? And the Vietnamese say to become a leader of Vietnam, you must be able to stand up to China, and you must be able to get along with China. That's what the Vietnamese are doing, and that's what Southeast Asians are doing also. And so at the same time, while Vietnam preserves its strategic autonomy, it's also, frankly, bold enough to increase its dependence to China. And I can tell you, what shocked me, the Vietnamese have now agreed to build a fast train between Hanoi and a southern Chinese city. That's amazing. With all that distrust, right? So, therefore, what the Chinese do is they give you space. They say, okay, You want to keep a certain distance, you keep your certain distance, but we can cooperate in areas where you're comfortable with. So the way in which they organize the way in which they exercise their power and influence, they don't make you say, I'm for China. They don't make you do that. They do it in a much more subtle way. But at the same time, the countries around in Southeast Asia and all have been dealing with China for centuries, right? The Thais have been dealing with China, I don't know how long. How many hundreds of years. They sent envoys to each other's courts and so on and so forth. So they understand each other. And there are ways and means, therefore, of subtly playing the game. And here, if I may say something, you know, in theory, especially under the Biden administration, Japan has moved closer to United States and, joined the various measures of United States and so on and so forth. But, when the Japanese communicate, right, it's very subtle, as you know. The Japanese never say no, right? And the Japanese, as you know, have this way of saying, there are two ways of communicating, hone and tatame. Hone means what you really believe is. Tatame is what the other person wants to hear from you. So they tell the Biden administration what the Biden administration wants to hear. Yeah, okay, fair enough. But quietly, very quietly, they're also sending signals that maybe they can live with China for the next 100, 200 years. And a Harvard professor, Ezra Vogel, pointed out that the two countries which have the longest recorded history are Japan and China, 1,500 years. And in these 1,500 years, China and Japan lived in peace for 1,450 years. So he says, why can't they live in peace for another 1,000 years? That 50-year aberration was very bad, very, very bad, 1895 to 1945.
Yeah.
But it was an aberration. So what is the norm? And so the Japanese will therefore very subtly, it will be done very, very subtly,
Yeah.
in a way that Western categories cannot capture.
No, so I agree with you to a
And so
large extent.
that's the nature of the slowly evolving. And I actually try to help my American friends by saying, please, watch all these subtle signals that are happening. That's the way the game is being played.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. No, so one of the things that Minister Jaishankar writes in his book, right, and I found it quite telling, and it's related to what you're saying, and others have written about this, that if you go back into history, the Indian Ocean region, Asia, never had this idea of one leader, right, one dominant power. Never. The Indian
That's
Ocean,
right.
and coming from the community that you do, right, the Sindhi community who's traversed
Yes.
those oceans as traders for many, many
Yes.
decades and centuries, you'll know this, that there isn't this idea that the Indian Ocean should be dominated by one power. Asia, by extension, shouldn't be dominated by one power. And that, I think, at least in the Indian characterization of the world order, also extends to a multipolar world. But as a result, it also translates into a multipolar Asia. And you've, I think, explained quite well that many countries around China are slowly, steadily, diplomatically, quietly, in various ways, trying to establish,
Adjusting to a new China,
adjusting
but
to
not
new time.
necessarily becoming subservient.
But does the Chinese establishment see the future of Asia as a multipolar Asia? Or would they like it, in basis your understanding of their thinking, would they like it to be
Yeah.
a China dominated Asia? Because to me,
No, I think
that's the key question.
this is the biggest advantage that the Chinese have, which is what, by the way, Henry Kissinger says this in his book on China too. They're geopolitical realists. China has only got one. Every Chinese government knows that keeping China together as one country for most of Chinese history has been very difficult. China has been disunited more often than it has been united. So the fundamental preoccupation of any Chinese government is to keep China together. That's the priority. And you deal with the rest of the world to fob off threats to your unity But you don't try to dominate the world. You don't need to dominate the world. China is big enough as a universe, right? And the only one big change, psychological change that the Chinese have made in the past, I would say 50 years or so, is that the Chinese have asked themselves, why did they suffer the century of humiliation? Why did the great powers trample all over China and they couldn't do anything about it? How could Japan conquer so much of China? And they realized the big mistake that China made was to build a wall around China. Big mistake. Because then the rest of the world grew and they didn't know what was happening. That's why Xi Jinping's speech in 2017 in Davos was a very important speech. He said China decided we can no longer be weak. So he said we plunged into the ocean of globalization. We struggled to swim. We drank water. By the end of the day, we emerged stronger. So that's the big difference that China has decided. China has decided to work with the rest of the world with the goal of strengthening China. And that's what they're engaging the rest of the world. So they
I
don't
mean,
have to
sounds,
conquer.
if
They
I
don't
may
have to
push back
conquer or
again,
dominate.
sounds very idealistic, yes, but the reality is that there are clashes happening, right? Day in, day out. Asia, before the Ukraine and the Middle East wars broke out, there was a lot of, you've seen it. There were clashes between India and China on the border. After 40 years, there were loss of lives. There was the Chinese and the Australians had a bit of a standoff, to put it mildly. The Chinese and the Japanese have had their own history. Taiwan is today now considered a big geopolitical hotspot. So while I get your point that on the nice side of things, yes, on the idealist side of things, that China can continue to have good relations and stay open and all of that. But you mentioned another very interesting thing in your book that you've used in your diplomatic career. This idea, I'm forgetting the exact term you've used, but this idea that whatever principle is applying has to apply universally. Right? You mentioned that
Yeah.
you've used it multiple times in your diplomatic career.
Universalization, universalizability.
Correct.
Yeah,
Now,
yeah.
and
That's just
that's
very
really where my
that's
question
a
was
good
coming from. If the Chinese expect the world to be multipolar, and they want the Americans to be more accommodative of their rise and accommodative of their values and all of that, and their interests in the world, then the Chinese have to have a similar, by the principle you've espoused, also have a similar view of Asia. But I can tell you from India's perspective, that's not the case. You can say
that's
that
not.
they might want it, but I can tell you, and we shouldn't beat around the bush. I think the view is very clear that the Chinese don't apply that same universal principle that they want at the world order level at the Asian level.
Well, you gave several examples of incidents, and you're right. But you got to, if you read Graham Allison's book, what he points out is that it's very rare for great powers to emerge without great wars. Now, the fact that China has had so many incidents that have not led to a great war shows a certain degree of strategic discipline. They've had a lot of incidents, you're absolutely right. But they're also making sure that none of them leads them to a great war. And the Chinese, by the way, also know when to compromise and back off when they have to do so. But when they do so in ASEAN, we keep quiet about it. We don't make a big fuss about it. We don't try to say, hey, we got the Chinese to change X, so and so on and so forth. And, for example, when the Chinese arm twisted Cambodia to stop ASEAN declaration, they learned a lesson very quickly after that. The pushback was so strong, they backed off. They didn't do it again,
No, so
right?
tactically they might be holding off, but strategically, is
Yeah,
their view of a multipolar Asia or not?
yeah. I think I think they would be very much happier to have a multipolar world because it gives
Asia,
them option.
Asia.
Asia, no, Asia, sure, of course, in Asia too, definitely. And they know if they, for example, they told ASEAN, stop all your ties with United States, stop your ties with Japan, stop with India. ASEAN will tell them go buzz off,
Of
right?
course,
Yeah,
as it would
and
to the
and
US.
and so I don't see that in this sense, again. Kissinger's book on China points it out. They're in that sense very careful, strategic players. And don't forget, at the end of the day, the Chinese still have a long way to go for developing their society. If their goal is to become a developed nation, their per capita income has got to double or treble. They still have a lot of work to do in China.
Of course, correct. Which is why I think
And the Chinese also know that the best way to derail their growth and development is to get sucked into a war, which is why they think the Russians are being very stupid in this Ukraine war. They don't think that's the way to do it. They're very unhappy about the Ukraine war, as you know. But they're not going to back off from supporting Russia, because if Russia collapses, all the West will focus all its attention on China.
I was going to say that actually it's served China well, right, to a large extent. That the focus has moved away from the Indo-Pacific hot conflicts that 2 years ago the Americans had started talking about. That Taiwan Straits unification by 2025 and 2027 is what the Chinese have in mind, and now that's the main discourse. The main discourse now is, of course, Ukraine and Russia, and now the Middle East.
But the Chinese also lost something. They were trying very hard to nudge the European Union to become a more strategic, autonomous actor on the global geopolitical scene, to be an independent pole in a multipolar world. But I can tell you that effectively, the Europeans have become, in strategic terms, vassal states of the United States. This is a consequence of the Ukraine war. And that's a tragedy. That's a big loss for China.
On the issue of conflict, do you expect any hot conflicts? Like, if you were to now peer into the crystal glass, do you expect Asia, like we've seen Middle East and Europe obviously be now, the stage of real hot conflicts of the last 2-3 years. Do you expect one in Asia over the next 3 to 5 years?
Well, touch wood, in general, if you look at my first book, Can Asians Think? Actually, it was published in 1998. I quote some American Aaron Friedberg, a political science professor, who said that Asia's future will be Europe's past. Just as all the major wars were fought in Europe, now after the end of the Cold War, the future wars will be fought in Asia. Now, since the Cold War ended in 1990, I think 35 years have gone by. And in these 35 years, there have been no major wars in Asia, but all the major wars are on the fringes of Europe, in Yugoslavia, in Ukraine. And it shows you, by the way, that there's some degree of geopolitical competence in Asia, where we know how to, manage these situations. And that's what's missing in Europe.
So let me ask you about the India-China relationship a little bit more. We've spoken about how the US and China, according to your view, can manage their relationship better.
Yeah.
India and China, of course, being the two of the largest economies in Asia, the two, of your multi-civilizational vision of the world, two of the ancient civilizations of the world, have had a strenuous relationship over the last few years, especially. From the vantage point that you've had, right? You're a China optimist, of course. You sit in Singapore, which has straddled the world.
And I'm also an India optimist, I must emphasize.
An India optimist,
everybody's an India optimist. So.
That's right. How would you say that from both sides, both from the Chinese side and from the Indian side, this relationship could be managed better from a practical standpoint, not on a idealistic, principles-based standpoint, but really on a practical level? What are 2 or 3 things that you think the Chinese could do differently to manage their relationship with India better? And what are 2 or 3 things the Indians could do differently to manage their relationship with China better?
Well, I can tell you the one thing that gives me sleepless nights is worrying about the China-India relationship.
So good. I'm glad that
because it's a tragedy that can be avoided. Any kind of war within China, a major war within China and India, or any kind of major downturn in China-India relations can be avoided. But both sides have to become very cold and cunning in their calculations on what they want from each other. And this relationship cannot be based on sentiment or love or affection. There'll be none of that stuff.
Yeah.
But what you need is for both sides to be very calculating on how each side can benefit from the other in the relationship. And certainly at this point in time, with China knowing that the pressure from the United States will increase over the next 10 years, they'd be an idiot if they don't accept that. The Chinese need strategic calm everywhere else, especially with India, right? Very, very clearly. So whatever they can do to keep the relationship with India on an even keel, calm, no drama, no problems, and then maybe cooperate in some areas, wherever it is. Again, the cooperation must be on the basis of mutually beneficial cooperation, which is that, if the Chinese set up a battery plant in India and it benefits India's economy by you being able to export more electric vehicles using Chinese battery technology to export more, then no harm doing that if it's a win-win kind of thing. So in the same way, in, India has also got to be very calm in dealing with China. And here I say this as an Indian. We Indians tend to get emotional very easily. And in geopolitics, the side that gets emotional is the side that is disadvantaged. At the end of the day, there are no saints, there are no sinners. This famous statement by Lord Palmerston: a country has no permanent enemies, no
Yeah.
permanent friends. It only has permanent interests.
Interests.
So just look at where the interests converge and work together where the interests converge. So, for example, in this whole question of climate change, how much responsibility should China and India take in terms of managing climate change, considering that it was the Western Industrial Revolution
Yeah.
that put most of the greenhouse gas emissions up there? Why we should get the West to pay a higher charge for that? Which is why, as you know, China and India used to collaborate very well
On the climate talks. Yeah.
at all the climate conferences also. So I think these are the sort of things that you need very cold, cunning calculations on both sides to say how can we use each other for our mutual benefit, but without in any way trying to become close friends or in any kind of ways. It's not possible because the level of distrust that has developed between China and India is quite amazing. It's a very high level of distrust that will not be easily eradicated. And we in Singapore are very puzzled by that level of distrust. Since you mentioned you lived in Singapore, the two communities that get on the best in Singapore are the Chinese and Indians. And there's one simple statistic.
Yeah.
The number of intermarriages
Yeah.
between Chinese and Indians is incredibly high. And right now, on the day when you and I are speaking, the president of Singapore,
Is here.
Tharman Shanmugaratnam, an Indian, is visiting China with his Chinese-Japanese wife, Jane Itogi.
Yeah. Visiting India. Yeah. Visiting India with his.
Yeah, so I mean, in Singapore, Chinese and Indians get along so well. I mean, so there is, if you look at it at a micro level, in terms of cultural affinity, there are no tensions at all between the Indian and Chinese communities in Singapore. But paradoxically, that's not translated at the level of the origin countries, China and India. But I think it can be done. This distrust that has developed between China and India will not go away anytime soon.
Yeah.
So, therefore, accepting the fact that there is distrust, how do you then try to work out a rational, mutually beneficial relationship with no pretense of trying to get close or don't make any statements saying, I mean, Hindi chini bye bye is already bye bye.
I think that's history. Yeah. That's history for now.
So I think we got to go back to a different kind of relationship.
Yeah, yeah. What about India overall, right? Now, of course, you mentioned you're an India optimist. I think families of Indian origin. You mentioned that, of course, India as a large economy has a greater role to play. But let me ask you this question from your vantage point. What is India on the diplomatic world stage, on the economic and geopolitical stage? What is India getting right today? And
Well,
what
I
are maybe
think
one or two things that it still needs to get right?
Well, I think India is in a geopolitical sweet spot. I mean, how many world leaders are there that can go to Moscow today
Yeah.
and hug Putin and go to Washington, D.C. and hug Donald Trump. Just name me how many leaders can do that. There are very few leaders who can do what the Prime Minister of India can do. So I think you are in a very fortunate situation now where you're being courted by everybody. But you must be very cunning. You must make sure that when you're being courted, that you end up achieving things that benefit your own interests and not necessarily the other side's interests. Because nobody is courting you because they love you. They're courting you because they want to use you, which is what happens in geopolitics all the time. So therefore, I think, in that sense, India should take advantage of this geopolitical sweet spot, develop close ties with as many countries as possible, but be very rational and calculating, and don't get seduced by rhetorical overtures. Because at the end of the day, what will grow the Indian economy is how open your economy is, how many free trade agreements you sign. The countries that are prepared to open up to you with free trade agreements are the countries that are going to help you grow and develop. And I can say one thing though, many Indians agree with me. India should seriously consider joining the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. Because if you can't compete with the ASEAN countries, who can you compete with? If ASEAN countries can compete in that free trade agreement, and the friends of India, like Singapore, like Australia, like Japan, bent over backwards to bring India into RCEP. But that's what you need to do, therefore. Do cold and cunning calculations where your interests are better served. And don't get swallowed by beautiful rhetoric.
Yeah, yeah. So let me transition. Like it's a nice segue. Once you start talking about RCEP, you've mentioned ASEAN earlier. Today you I think we've been very vocal about the UN Security Council seat that the UK should give up its seat to India. So let's for a brief moment like talk about global governance, institutions, and
Mm.
mechanisms. Right. What's
Mm.
your view of where the world is headed at that on that dimension?
Well, here the world is heading towards a tragedy because I say it's a tragedy because the world is shrinking. We are now living in a small, interdependent global village, really.
Yeah, very
I mean,
interconnected. Yeah.
this is proven to you by COVID, proven to you by global financial crisis. It'll be proven to you by new pandemics that will emerge, bird flu or whatever it is. And so when you live in a small global village, you need village councils, right? So this is the time to build stronger multilateral institutions, which is why it's such a tragedy that the United States has elected a president who wants to destroy global multilateral institutions. He's withdrawing from World Health Organization, he wants to withdraw from World Trade Organization, all that. That's crazy, absolutely crazy. So we are therefore in a paradoxical situation whereby when the demand for global governance institutions is rising, supply is diminishing.
But
But
is the
what the
US
rest of
only
the
to
world,
blame? Is you think the only the US is to blame for this?
I think only the United States is opposed to global multilateralism. The Europeans are sensible enough
No, one can
to
argue
understand.
that on your point on the UN Security Council, that the country most opposed, at least I'll share the Indian view, the country most opposed to letting India into the UN Security Council might not be the US or any of the European ones. Might be
Well,
India's Asian neighbor.
I was ambassador to UN for over 10 years, and the big secret, and I can tell you this. I think I revealed this in one of my book. I had a meeting with a very senior State Department official in his office, And I said, come on, tell me frankly, United States says it's in favor of expanding the Security Council. What's your real position? And this guy said to me, Kishore, Madeleine Albright and I, she was then Secretary of State, have both served on the Security Council. Having 15 members giving us enough problems,
No, no. So
we don't.
expanding is a different question, right, Kishore? I'm saying if the UK was to give it up,
Uh,
India was to be, let's say, given that seat,
uh.
would and the other four, which includes
Okay, let me answer the question
would they
directly.
be okay?
China will not veto India's admission.
Sorry.
China will not veto India's admission as a permanent member. I'll put it directly and bluntly. So, I've been involved in the negotiations, okay? What countries say about UN Security Council reform is not what they really believe.
Of course, it's like goes back to
They're just sweet
the
talking
distinction you gave with the
everybody.
Japanese two levels, right?
But I do strongly believe that the United Kingdom should seriously enhance its international position by giving up its Security Council seat. Because you know what? In the Security Council, it cannot do anything in opposition to the United States. Nothing. It's become essentially a vassal state of the United States, sadly, in the Security Council. So it should give up its seat and then play a much more independent role on the world stage, where it's not completely bound by the United States. Because once you're a permanent member, whatever the US does, you have to agree to it, and it's quite shocking.
Yeah, yeah.
The British delegate, when I was there, gave a brilliant speech on why United Kingdom, as a member of the International Criminal Court, could not accept any restrictions on the International Criminal Court. 2 weeks later, something happened. He argued exactly the opposite case.
Phone
So,
calls,
when you become like that, how does it enhance Britain's position
prestige.
to serve on the
That,
UN Security Council? And by giving it to India, it'd be a fantastic gesture, because clearly India is going to become the third largest economy in the world very soon. And as I've also said, if India ever announces that it will not abide by UN Security Council resolutions as long as it's not a member, then the Security Council is finished.
yeah, yeah. Let's talk about BRICS, right? So BRICS is emerging as yet another institution on the regional slash now global stage, right? What's your sense of what BRICS as a organization is getting right, and what you see as still the impediments for it to emerge as a much stronger, influential organization at the global governance level?
Well, I mean, I published an article actually in NDTV, which said that the G7 is a sunset organization and BRICS is a sunrise organization. There are not many countries queuing up to join the G7, because the G7 basically is now a meeting of what I call Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. Because there's only one player down there, United States, and the Seven Dwarfs say yes sir, yes sir, yes sir, yes sir. So it's not really a serious multilateral organization of any kind. Whereas in BRICS, it's not dominated by any of the members, even though China is much bigger. Everyone has a strong and independent voice of his own.
Indonesia just joined, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, and now many more are joining it. So clearly, this is an indication of how the world has changed. That the West has got to understand that all these Western-dominated organizations, which they're trying to dominate, like IMF, World Bank, should become more democratic and allow more space for the global South to give their views. And that's why I'm confident that BRICS will grow and play a greater role, and G7 will shrink.
Any key impediments, you think? Any key impediments that I think the BRICS as an organization still needs to overcome?
Well, I think there is certainly, I think the biggest obstacle to the growth of BRICS is the distrust within India and China, which I've spoken about. And I think this is again another place where both sides got to be very cold and calculating and say, yes, we have bilateral differences, but maybe we have a common interest in strengthening BRICS together, because we both benefit from it. So that's the game that has to be played.
Yeah. Kishore, one other thing. Sorry?
Yeah, go ahead. I will finish in about 5 minutes if you don't mind.
Okay, perfect. So let's move. This has been a fascinating conversation. We've covered a lot, I think, from your personal to the international and global. We end every podcast, Kishore, with a few very simple, seemingly simple, quick questions on recommendations, right? You've offered, I think, and this has really been a great contribution, I think, to the world stage, a view that has straddled India, China, Southeast Asia, the West, really the world. Right? And I think that's at least from someone who's looked up to world leaders and world thinkers. I think it's been a great contribution to many of us who've also tried to straddle those worlds. So here's my question. As you think about people who are thinkers, writers, academics, practitioners, who've managed to, similar to you, successfully straddle these worlds, be able to be critical and optimistic about multiple countries and all of that at the
Mm,
same time. What are some names
mm.
that come to mind who could also serve as, let's say, guests on our podcast in the future?
Well, I mean, I'll give you one name that he's, I think, I describe him as Asia's greatest historian. He's a friend and colleague of mine at the National University of Singapore. He's Professor Wang Gangwu.
Yes,
He's 94 years old,
yes.
but very active. And
Yeah.
if you Google his name,
I'm
you'll
familiar with
see
him.
all kinds of writings by him. And there's a very short book of conversations he carried out with another Malaysian academic, Wee Ki Beng, about Eurasia, which is very, very good. So I would say there are people like him whom many in the West haven't heard of,
Yeah,
who talk about how Asia, and especially how deeply connected Asia was in the past.
yeah, yeah, yeah,
You know,
yeah,
and especially and Southeast Asia. I think what Indians should know one basic fact about Southeast Asia. Out of the 10 countries in Southeast Asia, 9 have an Indic or Indian cultural base. One has a Chinese or Sinic cultural base. And so the old links between India and Southeast Asia have to be
immense.
revived.
Yes, 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 absolutely. Who do you rely on, Kishore, for your understanding of China? Other than, of course, your own experiences, are there thinkers or writers that you rely on or read with great
Well,
interest on China?
I find the best way is to talk to as many people as possible. So certainly, I can tell you that I learned a lot from Henry Kissinger, and unfortunately, he has passed away. But was a very close personal friend of the late Prime Minister of Singapore, Mr.
Lee
Lee
Kuan
Kuan
Yew.
Yew.
Correct.
And I think if people would listen more would pay more attention to Kissinger's book it's called On China, by the way,
Yeah, yeah,
On the title, they'll see that he gives very wise advice of how you manage China and think strategically, think long term, and not get boxed into all these short term categories
yeah. Any
that people.
Asian thinkers on China?
Oh, well, I think I would mention the former foreign minister of Singapore, Mr. Giorgio, has been very articulate also about China. I would mention him too.
Yeah. No, this has been great. Thank you so much. Any books that you recommend for people who are
Um,
interested in the kinds of topics we've discussed today? Any books that you recommend? Of course, other than your own or mine, which of course we've encouraged our readers to read.
yeah, yeah. Well, when you get very busy writing,
You don't
you
get to read.
fall back in your reading of books. So I can't think of anything immediately. But you sometimes have to go back to. Okay, I'm going to give you a sort of very unusual recommendation.
Yeah.
Over Christmas, I was watching a British TV series called Wolf Hall about Cromwell
Yeah.
and palace intrigue. And I think that's the kind of geopolitical realism that we will need to study.
Yeah.
How you manage a very messy, murky world that is coming.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. No, this has been great. Thank you for these recommendations, Kishore, and thank you for letting me
Yeah,
call you Kishore.
yeah,
Because as I was telling you, much more naturally comes Ambassador
yeah.
Mahbubani to me. But I want to end our conversation with a quote from your book,
Yeah.
from your most
Please go ahead.
recent book, because I think it's really a great ode to Asia and its future. And I found it. I've printed it. I want to keep it with me. So I'm going to read it out with your permission. Um, it has been my joy to live the Asian dream and perhaps contribute a little to the realization of the Asian century. It is truly heartening to realize that the path I've trodden, from poverty to plenty, from ignorance to education and intellectual curiosity, will now be replicated by millions, if not billions, of fellow Asians. To have been a pioneer in this great Asian renaissance has been one of the greatest privileges and fulfillments of my life. I think that really beautifully captures, I think, your life, your journey, and it's a great ode, I think, to Asia and its future, and I think also the future of the world.
Mm. Thank you. You're very kind to do that. I've really enjoyed this conversation.
Me too. Thank you so much. And I hope that, as I'm sure travels will bring you to India, I hope
Yeah.
that we get to meet in person again soon.
Yes, I'm participating in the Jaipur Literary Festival in
Oh, great.
February.
At the end of Jan, yeah.
Will you be there?
I might be there. I might be there. I'm actually,
Let's
yeah.
meet. Let's meet in person there.
Yeah, I've been there for the last couple of years. I'm hoping that I'll be there
Yeah.
again this year also.
Okay.
I'll
Good.
definitely
Please.
be in touch. Great. Thank you so much. I'll
Thank you.